This is Shaunak Roy. We have a wonderful webinar this afternoon and a wonderful panel. But before we get started, I want to give everybody about maybe like 30 to 60 seconds before we get started, just so that I see people are trickling in. So just give us 30 seconds. I'm going to be on mute for 30 seconds and we'll kick off right at 1:01 Eastern Time. All right. So actually it's already 1:01 on my clock. So we will get going. Again, welcome to this webinar on student engagement and blended learning after the pandemic. It's a timely topic. My name is Shaunak Roy. I'm the founder and CEO of Yellowdig. We have a wonderful panel with us today, and I'm going to very quickly mention who they are. And after that, I'm going to pass it on to Bryan Alexander, who is going to moderate the panel for us. So we have Susan Nix from Lubbock Christian University. We have Andrew Feldstein from Fort Hays University, and our friend Bryan Alexander from Georgetown University, who is going to help us get going. So with that, Bryan, do you want to take over?
I do. Thank you, Shaunak, for introducing us, and thank you, Shaunak, on behalf of Yellowdig for hosting us. I really appreciate the opportunity. Let me welcome everybody. The chat box is live, so if you would like to throw us your questions and thoughts, please feel free to. In fact, the nice thing to do is just to quickly say where you're coming from today. So I can say Manassas, Virginia, USA. As we go, if you'd like to throw us questions, that chat box is good, but also the Q&A box should be live, so you could throw questions that way, and we'll be looking forward to them. And hello to Illinois, Tennessee, Minneapolis or Minnesota, New Jersey. Seem to have Lubbock. Hello, Beaumont. We seem to have quite a bit of representation from the Northeast and especially the Midwest. Hello again, Chicago. Good to see all of you. And Baltimore, all right. And that's San Diego, I hope. San Diego might be something else, but it's. I'm glad to see all of you here. And please, we'll be bringing this in. Debbie, I hope you've got some sign of spring. I know in the North Country, nobody values spring like people in the North Country. Marie Denier in Quebec, she knows what I'm talking about. 12 inches in her front yard. Debbie, we'll think of you. So today's session is dedicated to looking at what happens to student engagement in terms of blended learning. And we're looking at the lessons learned from the past 2+ years of the pandemic. What do we know about how best to teach in an environment combining face-to-face and online? What have we learned as faculty? What have we learned as support staff and strategists? And what have we learned as students? So I just want to introduce my two fellow co-panelists. Dr. Susan Nix at Lubbock Christian is a passionate teacher who reflects deeply on her teaching and learning, is really committed to, among other things, kids and students in general. Susan, would you like to say a couple of words about yourself and how you approach this topic?
Yes, in preparation for this, I did some reflection and trying to figure out how did my teaching perspective develop. And I have to say I'm not done yet. I think it's an evolving thing. And as we talk, I'll share some of the things that I realized in my reflection. So I'm looking forward to this. If you look up the definition of blended learning, you'll get a variety of definitions. And so that's interesting. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out today that helps everybody.
Indeed. We just had a long blog plus article plus Twitter storm about redefining blended learning, synchronous and asynchronous learning, and nobody came to any settled conclusion, which is often a good sign. Speaking of being unsettled, Dr. Andrew Feldstein is there. You can see he is in a very tense and stressful background. Andrew, what would you like to add to us, to our understanding of you and to your understanding of blended learning?
Well, sure. My team here at Fort Hays State University is, we have the instructional technologists, instructional designers, a faculty development team as well. We have spent, obviously, the last couple of years steeped in everything that we needed to do in order to get us through these interesting times we've been in. I think at Fort Hays, we have an interesting perspective because of the balance of students that we have. We have about 4,000 or so students here on our campus in Western Kansas. We also have another 7,000 plus students who are online students, plus an additional 4,000 students on campus in China. And so having to deal with those very different modalities and really getting an interesting sense through the pandemic of the very real differences between how those three populations have needed to negotiate learning through the pandemic has really, it's been a meaningful experience for us all.
It has indeed. It has indeed. Well, thank you both for unfolding a bit more about yourselves. And Susan, hello. Which dog was that just burst in?
I'm sorry. Her name is Fiona. She's part Great Pyrenees and part Saint Bernard.
Well, no, I'm always glad to see animals. And hello, Fiona. One of my cats is staring at me now, trying to figure out one of those crucial cat decisions. Should I jump on human or should I meditate some more? Well, this is actually one of the fun things I found about learning with this live online medium is these little glimpses into people's lives. I mean, if it's an imaginary one, like the backgrounds that Shaunak and Andrew have, that's still important because that tells us something about what they're thinking, what they're feeling, maybe what they need. Although if Andrew is in Florida, I don't know where he's putting that up, but you know, it tells you something.
It's real, Brian. That's actually sort of looking forward and looking back. That's the beach I grew up on. That's the beach where we spend every summer, and so I'm looking forward to being there in a couple of months. It's up in the South Shore of Massachusetts.
Oh.
I wonder if I've been there. Well, but just think about this quick exchange. I mean, if I draw attention to this, we just learned a bit more. So if Andrew is your instructor, students just had that opportunity to connect with him a little more deeply. And if he was a student, the same thing. Meanwhile, in contrast, Susan and I have our cameras on, either very convincing fake backdrops or real backdrops. And again, you could tell what we think is important and what we privilege. Let me ask both of you, just to riff a bit more on this theme. Looking back over the past 2 years, what do you think we've learned as faculty, as instructors, about teaching in the blended environment? What has COVID taught us about that?
Well, from a combined public school and higher ed perspective, working with people in public schools, in the news, you hear a lot of negative comments about the lack of growth for students. That can be a little bit depressing if you fall for that. I don't believe that, because when I was doing the blended learning research, you know, just looking over it, the research doesn't say that. The research really doesn't support that students lose from this environment. There's criticism largely due to technology difficulties still being ironed out. Districts in public schools were caught unprepared for the needs of all their students, and in some cases students didn't have access to the technology, so then schools had to extend their Wi-Fi out to the parking lot, et cetera, that kind of stuff. And then teachers also had to very quickly learn how to make their classes more what the students needed, instead of just listen to what I'm saying and do your assignment kind of thing. So I heard lots and lots of input from both teachers and from students. From my perspective, I'm constantly looking for ways to improve my teaching. I'm not done yet. I'm listening to students to hear what they think about my classes. I really, really invite them to give me feedback on what works and what doesn't work for them. It's a constantly evolving environment.
Well, this is hugely important. If I could, Susan, I just want to pull these three apart. You mentioned the surprise at reports of student learning falling behind, and that's mostly coming from the K through 12 space. There was a report a few days ago about elementary schools, and I think we can dive into this and press on this a little bit further. You also drew our attention to the digital divide and how important that's been, and how a lot of schools try to address that, but ultimately it still remains. And then, if I may, your personal example of yourself reflecting on your teaching practice and developing it still further, that's also what you see teachers doing as a result of the pandemic. Does that sound right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, how about you? What do you see faculty learning in the blended space over the past 2.5 bizarre years?
They were bizarre. I really think that one of the things that became crystal clear is the space around the social piece, the connected piece, that not simply the classroom content delivery piece, but we learned this actually pretty early. Back in January of 2020, we learned that our students in China were all going home, and that courses would be online. Now, normally we have faculty in China that teach in classrooms. And of course, at the end of January of 2020, in my mind, I said to myself, well, only in a country like China could they just decree that everybody goes home and we do classes online. I was quickly proven wrong. But what happened was we started building courses. We have 4 weeks to start putting together and transition courses from face-to-face courses to online courses. And we worked as hard as we could. We had barriers, the great firewall barrier of wondering what type of content would be blocked and that sort of thing. But when we finally got it all together, the first response that we had from our students was a sense of loss. It was, where's my instructor? I'm used to being in the same place. And I can't connect directly with them. I can't connect directly with the other students. I'm feeling isolated and alone here. And this became something that was echoed for the next 1.5 years, not just with our students in China, but our students who are on campus here in Hayes, as well as our students who are online. And so for me, a lot of what was important were building those connections, the things that, well, for our face-to-face students had occurred naturally. We didn't have to create situations for our students in the class to say hi to one another before class started, or to sort of unpack our lectures after the class was over. But now it was more on us to be able to build those environments like you did at the beginning of this conversation, Bryan, and just to sort of, bring in that personal piece, that social piece that connects us together, because that's where the learning takes place, is through those feedback loops and through talking and sharing and that sort of thing.
These feedback loops, indeed, going back and forth. Between the two of you, we just answered the question in an extraordinary amount of depth. Dr. Feldstein, you just drew attention to the importance of factors around classes. So, you think about student life, residence life for those who have residential housing, but also just the interactions, the whole social aura around the classroom. You mentioned the Chinese factor, that you learned about the pandemic when your Chinese campus students first had to go home, and then your infrastructural concern about the Great Firewall. But then especially this sense of loss, the loss of presence. Where is my instructor? Not, just how do I feel them being here, and then how do we maintain that? This is powerful stuff, and already we have a really solid outline. If I could ask both of you just to press on this a little bit further, Dr. Nix, you're talking about you're surprised at students falling behind in online learning, and I'm wondering, do you see blended learning as the best way to address this? That combination of online and face-to-face, or where do you see this working well that we should try to imitate and avoid the problems that we've seen?
I think blended learning is a really good, or hybrid presentations are a really good way to still make that connection with your students, because as my colleagues, the connecting piece is missing maybe online if someone's not really putting their whole attention to that environment. I think it's about concentrating on that. When you're in the room with someone, then it's much easier to establish eye contact, body language, all those other things that we do when we're communicating. I think the hybrid sets up the class that you're teaching in higher ed for success. You can set the tone as the professor when you first meet face to face, by telling what you think is important, by explaining how you set up the class. What keeps coming to my mind is my speech class in my bachelor's, where the professor said, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. Yes. And that still pertains in hybrid classes, because then in my online design, see, when I went to higher ed, I'd already spent many, many years in public ed as a teacher and then as an administrator. And then when I went to higher ed, the first year I taught face-to-face. And then the second year, the dean said, we're moving to online. And so I had to do some research on what that meant, how to design a course online, what was the best way to do it. And of course, that's continued to evolve as this kind of thing has evolved as well. So did that answer what you asked?
It really, really does. I love your focus on the hybrid, but also the instructor setting the tone right from the start. If I could just press on one point, okay. And if Susan, if you could answer, and then Andrew, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Where do faculty learn these lessons? What are the sources? I mean, we've got the idea of in the chat, Richard Schultz has shared the Global Online Learning Development Extended Network, for example, as a community of practice. I mean, should faculty or have faculty been using such online communities of practice? Do you find teaching and learning centers on campus to be a good center for that? Is the library a center for that? Or is it one's professional colleagues, either in one's own department or in the same department at other institutions? Where do faculty learn how to do this stuff?
I think primarily from the IT department, as material came, as equipment came out and software came out, and that's where it starts. And then workshops are provided. And then of course, because I had to move to the online environment, and as a professor, you're required to do research. Well, it was a perfect fit to do online design research. And then I presented that in the UK, which was pretty exciting to be amongst other people that were sharing in another country how they created online classes and have that published. It was nice, just an extra bonus. But primarily the IT people, and that continues because I retired, and then now I'm working as an adjunct at LCU because I'm not done, like I said. And the IT department and personnel continue to impact me as they learn things, and as the equipment and software evolves, they share that with us. And then it's a matter of being flexible, watching for those announcements and participating, and then taking a risk and trying it. And then I learn from my students as well. It's a back and forth thing.
I want to come back to the students in a minute, but first I want to give Andrew a chance to answer the question. Where's the professional support for you?
Well, I mean, you mentioned a lot of options a minute ago, Brian, and my answer is really all of the above. Yes, in my group, which is Teaching Innovation and Learning Technologies, we we were basically on high alert for 2 years and put out a lot of workshop, a lot of resources, a lot of individual one-on-one consultations to help faculty to understand the things that they could do to make the experience better for themselves and their students. However, none of that would have meant anything if the faculty hadn't first understood that this was a need. And that's what happened during the early stages of the pandemic, was that, again, back to the feedback loop of the students, particularly those that were used to being in the classroom with their students and used to the luxury of that very easy one-on-one connection, all of a sudden felt deprived of that, and then started to do things that they thought was going to make that better. Some of it worked, some of it didn't work. And so there was this sense of frustration among faculty. There was some sense of disconnect among students. And so at that point, they went to other colleagues and asked them what they were doing. They came to us and asked them, what are the types of processes that we can put in place that are going to help us to connect better? They basically, on their own, they bootstrapped a whole bunch of things that they thought were going to help with the process by asking themselves the question, okay, here's what I do in a face-to-face classroom. How can I reinterpret this so that it's going to work online? And one of the things that we say to faculty time and time again, sometimes in order to create the exact same experience that you have in a face-to-face class with your students, you have to do something completely different. And so for me, having the university as an entire system of faculty and students and all of the support mechanisms all combined together to be basically sort of create this support network so that we could move through this and learn how to better connect in environments and situations where we had never felt we needed to do that before.
So it's a kind of all of the above solution, a complex ecosystem of support, really.
Absolutely.
And part of it's bootstrapped and part of it's pre-existing. Between the two of you, I think you just gave advice to the entire world. And I think that's excellent. I want to come back to a point that we've just touched on. I want to make sure that we can spend some time focusing in on it. I've had you talking about the faculty experience, but I'm very curious about how you saw the student experience changing. Susan mentioned some of the reports we have of declining learning, and Andrew, you mentioned some of the challenges of that kind of social thickness, that social connection that we need to maintain. How have students fared? How have students made blended learning work? What have you seen?
Well, we have, after in May of 2020 and again in May of 21, we surveyed our students. In both those instances, the first survey in 20 was really more about trying to figure out, we approached the survey wrong, I think, and my fault, but it was, how did you do in your courses? And so the primary answer to the questions was, we did okay. We maintained a certain consistency for them and everything was pretty good there. However, we also asked a question at the end of the survey, which is more of a qualitative question, say, other than just your basic classroom interactive experiences, transactional experiences, how did you do during this period of time? And that's where the gates opened and where people started talking about their sense of disconnection, their feelings of lack of loss of motivation and loneliness and all of these other things that really, really made it clear to us that moving forward, as we needed to do in the fall of 20 and the spring of 21, to be able to keep things online, but to try to move those to emphasize the social, to emphasize interactions, to emphasize collaborative learning in a way that you can through platforms like Yellowdig and various ways and strategies that you can create to help, because they didn't want canned lectures. They didn't want their instructor to video 50 minutes of what would have been in class because there was a barrier between that video and them. They wanted a more direct connection, and learning how to make those direct connections and everything that we could do to support that process was really needed, was our focus and our mission throughout the following year.
The kind of co-design, co-creation process.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very, very moving, actually. Susan, did you want to join on that?
Yes, I did, because one of the professors at LCU very kindly from the College of Business shared some research that he conducted during the last 2 years. And he got direct comments from students about online learning. The direct comments are what he shared. Well, he shared the article, the published article, as well as the direct comments, the raw data. They said a lot of what Dr. Feldstein just said, that they wanted that direct connection. In fact, what's surprising is they have a high standards and high expectations for interaction with the professor. They want the professors, they express the need for the professors to understand technology. They express the need for flexibility. They express the need for understanding that they've gone from an environment where they used to go to take a break at home to a learning environment in the same location. And that caused a little bit of conflict for them because it was hard to distinguish when they were in class and when they were supposed to be taking a break, and it kind of blended it together for them. That kind of information is very, very helpful. And like Dr. Feldstein just said, they don't care much for lecture. And I never did really like to lecture. I like to pick out important concepts of a unit or a lesson and then present that briefly in a PowerPoint that I record. And that's what I want them to get, but that's also what I want them to discuss, because part of the learning environment and using Yellowdig, the forum at LCU, is the assimilation of the new information, because my students are graduate students. So that means they have life experiences and school experiences. And I want them to take that information, see how it plays out in their professional experience, and then report back and tell, does it look like that? How do you feel about it? Can you try something else? Especially because of the class I'm talking about is the research class. And so they're all conducting research in their environment, and their environments vary from sports to the classroom. So there's coaches, there's classroom teachers, there's administrators. And so they have to figure out a research project that fits in that environment. And so there's the interaction hybridly when they first meet me. And then there's the online presence. And then I give them my phone number. I've yet to have a student overuse or abuse that, calling me too much or anything like that. I am there if they need me. That's important.
Both of you make this point of presence and connection so strongly. I admire. But also both of you seem to describe teaching as both a kind of co-created process between faculty and students, but also one that's clearly in process, that's not yet finished. I mean, Susan, earlier you said, you're not done, you're retired and you're still doing it. But yeah. I think that's very different from the sense of kind of like a polished, completed lecture that we might get. I wanted to ask Shaunak about this, because Shaunak, you have an unusual perspective in that you've got Yellowdig being used at a wide range of colleges and universities. Through that perspective, what have you seen about how students have made blended learning work?
So, the thing I would say is that what Susan and Andrew kind of mentioned in terms of the need is what we have seen across the board. I think, there is a need for flexibility, because in a blended learning environment, students are looking for that, because they are asking for those environments, either because of COVID or some other situation happened, they cannot just be on that synchronous session, but they don't want to lose out on that connection that is formed in those synchronous sessions. So they're asking for similar engagement opportunities outside of that synchronous session. So that is what we have seen, the need for flexibility without losing the human connection that happens, either peer-to-peer or with the student, with the instructor. That has been the broad theme across the board for us. The thing where we see, where we as a company, we have kind of engaged with faculty across the board is kind of designing intentional community environment, because one of the challenges that happens is students by themselves may not actually engage, or they may not know how to engage. Some of them may, but not everybody. So how do we make it inclusive so that everybody understands how to engage with one another and with the instructor, irrespective of the modality of the classroom, whether it's heavily synchronous or heavily asynchronous, the community can kind of, blend across those two environments. So that's kind of the broad theme that we have seen. I don't know, Bryan, if that's helpful.
That's hugely helpful. I mean, I love the way you phrased this in terms of designing intentional community environment. So again, there's the idea of kind of class as space, class as a design space to work through, but also one that welcomes all students to engagement. I heard one person say years ago that equal opportunity was being allowed to enter a dance, but actual equality means being asked to dance. And it sounds like you're trying to help us make both the dance floor and the dancing happen at the same time.
I just wanted to
Please
talk about this a little bit more in terms of student differences. We have some very clear differences between our traditional face-to-face students and the 18-plus-year-old area, but most of our online student population is older and they have families and they have jobs, and so they look at the education point a little bit differently. But where I wanted to go with this was when Shaunak was talking about people not necessarily knowing how to connect. There's also the issue of knowing if it's okay to connect. Some of our first-gen students, folks that have not necessarily been in an educational environment for long, may be less comfortable reaching out to their instructor, less comfortable reaching out to fellow students, not knowing if that's okay. And so we may find that some of our students that are more comfortable in the environment, they have families that have been college educated, have a different expectation of how well they can connect with their instructor. And someone who was a face-to-face student in a class who maybe felt it was okay to stand up after the class was over and wait and ask the instructor a quick question is not going to be a student that would be comfortable emailing that instructor, or might not even be comfortable going to that instructor's office hours because they would feel a divide there. And so this is another barrier that we need to overcome in terms of encouraging the types of connections for all of our students.
And if I can add one thing there, Bryan and Andrew, is, we hear from our instructors, and probably one of the most common feedback we get after they use our platform for a while, or some sort of a social learning platform, is they're hearing from the students they would rarely hear from. Yes. That is the most common feedback. And when we try to unpack that, what we find is that the synchronous sessions, typically they are time bound, right? And folks who are most conscious about speaking up in front of everybody, or they probably for whatever reason don't have the confidence, they tend to get more confidence to be asynchronous. So building a community or these social environments where the students have the flexibility to connect with one another when they want, at their own time, is quite helpful for that inclusivity standpoint, because I think a lot more students will feel or does feel empowered to speak up.
We all participate in different ways, and that's something which is a human thing. If you think about a lecture without any technology, certain people will feel free to ask questions and participate. If you think about a seminar, it'll be a different mix of people, or a lab. I would love to turn to all of you participants, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts and questions. And again, the chat box is open, and as is the Q&A box, if you've got a question you'd like. I do want to touch on a couple of the notes that come up that are just wonderful. Richard Schultz has hammered that students don't like lectures because they're passive, and he hates them, and students don't like them. Arthur Friedrich adds that where there's an out and out lecture, the correct content for delivery has to be very important. Xin-Li Wang mentions that building a learning community is always a priority for any course she designs. In-class activities are planned with this goal in mind as well. And that brings us to a great question that came up from, I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, Alden Kirchner, who asks, well, what in a blended environment, what would you use the in-person time for? And we had an initial couple of responses that came in. One of them was to use them for, hang on, I just pulled this up, for active learning and to do some discussion. What do you think? What's the best use of that kind of that situation when you have live in-person space?
I mean, in part, that's situational. It depends on the type of course and what type of activities you want to be using. But I think activities is the operative word. It is not the time to have people sitting quietly listening. It's the opportunity. It's another channel for connection, another opportunity for people to connect. And depending upon the class, depending upon the trajectory where you are within the trajectory of a course, I think it would be different things that would happen in that time that are in fact contextual, situational, and will add to the student experience at that point in time.
Agreed, Andrew, that's exactly right. And you know, one of the things that was mentioned in the research that was shared with me was that students like to hear from each other. And so in the hybrid class that I'm thinking about that I teach at LCU, the research class, the students like to hear about each other's research. So when we meet face to face, that's an opportunity for them to talk about the status of their research at the moment, and for me to answer questions, help them figure out things, and for each other to hear what they're all doing.
I love that. I teach a digital storytelling class, and my students are always nervous about the videos they're producing, and they're very nervous right up until the end. And they're like, "Oh, this is awful!" And then they show each other all of their work, and by then there's just tears everywhere because they're so stunned at what everybody has done. It's a wonderful bonding community and also individually affirming moment. I'm curious, Shaunak, what have you seen in your work through Yellowdig? I mean, what are some of the live practices that we should really emphasize?
There are, as Susan and Andrew, you kind of pointed out, we see a lot of innovation in terms of blending the asynchronous portion of the engagement with the synchronous or the in-classroom. One practice comes to mind, which I love, is I've seen faculties who are looking right before the class, they look at the community engagement for the last 1 week, look at all the discussion that has happened, and pick 1 to 3 topics right from the community, and then bring that into the classroom discussion. Have the students who kind of posted or commented to kind of reaffirm and speak to the rest of the class or share their point of view. That's one practice comes to mind. I don't know, Susan, I don't know if have you seen, based on your, students kind of giving feedback to each other's research, seems like it's something very similar.
Yes, it is. And in fact, I use sometimes what they have shared to change the class, to modify the class some, or to modify a presentation that's online, because what they've offered is so important, and I hadn't thought about it that way. And so I use what they say. You're so right.
I think that's always a really good idea. It's a form of validation and almost a kind of publication if you will.
Can I take us for a left turn for a second?
Well, if you're heading south, that might take us into the Atlantic. So let's see how far it goes.
So this is sort of like a meta concept, because all of this is developing. This is what we thought about all of this 2 years ago, and what we think about it now is very different. As I'm looking at this conversation we're taking place in that is taking place at the moment, and looking at the chat box and seeing the interactions that are taking place. And for me, I'm getting the sense, even in this conversation that we are all having, that this is a much more fluid, natural type of conversation than this would have been in early days of COVID, when we were having this type of webinar where things would have been potentially more stilted and more structured and less fluid, and that the conversations in the sidebar would have been maybe not quite as on point as they seem to be today. And so I just wanted to bring that up, to think about the fact that where we are now as faculty, as administrators, where our students are, is a very different place, because we've all experienced for the last 2 years what to us have been good practices, bad practices, effective practices, and have started to rethink this entire process.
That's a great point. I love the part about fluidity. I mean, I'm tweeting this out and got some feedback. I'm participating in the chat box, and I'm seeing great questions. I'm going to bring it up in a second. We've got a question in the Q&A, and it's a very fluid. I feel a bit like I'm in a jazz performance or in improv theater. It's very, very comfortable in quite a few ways. In the chat, speaking of which, Arthur Friedrich adds, also used face-to-face time when using adaptive learning to spend some time on digging into areas where there was a misconception or was challenging for the class as a whole, which is, I think, excellent. We have a question from Xingli Yuang, who says, what made you teach your very first blended learning course? I assume most of us start our teaching career doing traditional lectures. That's a great question.
Can I answer that? Yep. The first thing that comes, and this has been repeated several times during this panel, is this is driven by student need. Student need in a variety of ways. Where I live in the panhandle of Texas, students live sometimes at great distances. And so there's a convenience to offering a class in the blended environment where they can join us online when I'm doing face-to-face, or they can actually be here if they want to drive an hour and a half or 2 hours to get here. But the online environment offers opportunities to students that they might not have had because of the distances that we're talking about, never mind other countries, but even just within the region, the distances they have to travel. So very much student need driven, I think.
Well, that's a good point.
I've been teaching blended classes since for 12 years or so. And it was driven at that point, even all of the students for me were face-to-face students, but it was to sort of extend the boundaries of the classroom so that students had a time and space to process things that didn't happen in a classroom. I usually refer to door jam amnesia as the effect of, when students walk out of your classroom and they've totally forgot, I don't know. they forgot.
Right there.
Well, maybe they wanted to stop me from saying this, but but then what happens is when they leave, and then 2 days later they come back, and as they walk through that same door, they remember what they should have done when they left the first time. So creating an environment, creating a space, be it a blog or some sort of an online environment for students to share, to think about things together with one another that takes place outside of the classroom environment is the type of blending that I found to be extremely effective.
It's a kind of persistence of the work. Again, the space becomes persistent, more accessible, becomes kind of thicker. I've got to say the first times I taught a blended class was in the 1990s. And if I describe the technology now, you'd think I was talking about something from steampunk, but it was precisely for that point, Andrew. It was to expand the class and to bring in students who are having a hard time with it. The first time I taught a hybrid class or a HiFlex class was in 1999 in Sweden. And Susan, it was the same issue. I had a group full of people, a room full of Scandinavians, which meant a pretty quiet room. But also there were people from across Scandinavia, from Denmark to Finland and Norway, who were participating online because they physically couldn't make the trip. And I remember that first moment where I felt those two different audiences and then realized they were the same. And I realized the 21st century was starting. I'm curious, Shaunak, I want you to bring in your perspective, and both personally as well as from Yellowdig. What do you think the best way? Well, first of all, have you done this yourself, and what have you seen of people getting started with blended learning?
Yeah, so my point of view, as founding the company, my passion was to make learning more equitable, and so that it's more democratic, so that people can participate more into the learning process. And going back to this discussion that we're having around, students are naturally engaging because we live in this world of social media. Facebook has been around for more than like 10 years now, and at this time, I think the barrier for people to actually go online and create a piece of content, could be a video about something or could be a blog post. People are quite comfortable now. So in their social lives, they are starting to interact with one another online as if, the connectivity that only used to happen physically, now people are perfectly comfortable doing it online, especially in this world of COVID, where our entire lives are online almost. Yeah. So that's a great news because most learners, irrespective of age, are pretty comfortable to be connecting with one another online. The question comes to really using that behavior or motivation, but designing around a learning environment. And I think that is the key part, which is sometimes, more difficult than you would imagine, because the challenge we sometimes see is that, let's say, instructor creates a forum and asks the students to come and talk to one another. We know how it goes, right? I mean, people will come in, maybe they will engage for a day or two, and then after that, it just slowly falls off because there's no intentional design connecting that online forum with what's happening in the classroom or around the subject. So I think the part around the behavior is already there. I think what it takes is that intentional design to blend that online environment with what's really happening in the learning environment. And the good news is that technology is there. I mean, we are living in the 21st century. I mean, social media and other technologies are all available. It's a matter of designing it for the learning part of it.
Again, with design, this is so important. I'm struck, Shaunak, by your connection with what one participant said earlier. I think it was Richard Schultz who was talking about emergency online learning, emergency remote teaching, which was done in a hurry with not a lot of time for design. But now we're 2 years into this, 2 years plus. And so we've had time for the kind of reflection that Susan's been talking about. And we've had time for the kind of co-creation that Susan and Andrew were talking about. And we're surfacing all these practices, and we're really, really getting, I think, better at this. As Andrew said, our conversations are more fluid and more on point. Shaunak, you also remind me stats about how people meet each other romantically. Now, meeting online is the leading venue for actually meeting people online. So if we can do that, we can definitely teach well online. We have more questions coming in. One from Rebecca Bagdy, who says, when you are simultaneously teaching a live and online section, how do you keep the online audience engaged? We want to do activities in person that you can't do online, but that doesn't work if part of the group is not present. How do you adjust? Speaking of design, good question, Rebecca. Who wants to tackle that one?
I haven't experienced that yet. but I've already started thinking since I read that question, I could see that would be difficult. If you only had, in my case, I've only ever had 1 or 2 people online at the same time, and usually just one. And if, in that case, you could have them interact with a group in the classroom if they're doing an activity, just with that group, talking to them and working with them, depending on what you're doing. But that's something I'm going to have to give some thought. I really appreciate that question. Thank you.
And it is a good question, and it is difficult.
Mm.
And my initial response would be rethinking what you're going to do. And because in fact, we're talking about 2 very separate modalities. And if you've designed something for your face-to-face students, you're disadvantaging the online students by definition. And the same vice versa if you're designing it for online. So a whole new type of creativity needs to take place in terms of what type of activities will be effective for both of your populations simultaneously, while at the same time engaging both populations. Mm-hmm. Again, I'll go back to my earlier response. We talked about it's going to be contextual. It's going to be based upon your students. It's going to be based upon your content. It's going to be based upon your class process, but it's hard.
Yeah. And one of the things I'd like to add to what you just said is there's a great deal more purposeful commitment from the professor to interact with the students. When I've used Blackboard before at a different university, I didn't find that as engaging as Yellowdig. I actually look forward to going into Yellowdig and interacting with all the students. I look for their posts. It's not a chore or a task, it's a conversation. That's the difference between one environment and the other. And it's where I can reteach on Yellowdig. I can correct on Yellowdig. I can encourage interaction between students on Yellowdig. There's so much that can be done in that social media. And I think that's the real commitment of the professor to the environment with the students. And also, I should say from student to student, because the way that Yellowdig has set it up, that you can get points for yourself when you interact with a student, if you're a student, and when students interact with you, they get points. There's points given, and students are competitive, and they like to get those extra points. Everybody wants an A. That environment is still there. They all want to do their best. That's my feeling, at least with my graduate students. They don't want to waste any of their time. And so when they give their comments, I ask them not to use texting language. I ask them, I said it so that you can't just answer, I agree with you. That's not a substantive response for a graduate student. So they do really quality responses back and forth with each other. And then I celebrate that in there.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I'd like to, well, so those are some answers that we've got right there. But I want to expand this question by adding a question from Patricia Anderson, who asks us, well, what about accessibility and students with disabilities or differences who may or may not be comfortable or able to participate in the same ways? And I would think here under people who may not be comfortable, thinking of people either with invisible disabilities, such as neural issues, or diversity, equity, and inclusion ideas. I mean, how do we welcome everybody in a blended environment, given all those different situations? Shaunak, you've got to deal with this on a daily basis in Yellowdig. Would you like to start us off on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the first thing is that the platform that you're using has to be WCAG compliant. There are certain accessibility standards out there where a technology can be used with a screen reader so that somebody who cannot, let's say, click through can still experience the platform is important. We spend a lot of time in that area. So that's kind of the first thing I would say. The other thing I kind of, I would say, which is important for accessibility, but also important for learning is being able to create content with a variety of types of media. So essentially in Yellowdig, one of the things we make sure is that the learner can either type up, if they are comfortable typing, they can quickly create a video. If that's kind of what they're comfortable with, they can record themselves and post without a video. They can create a poll if they just want a quick feedback of 3 questions, which one is the best for me or somebody else. So having that multi types of media, which kind of promotes multi-sensory learning, because people learn differently, Bryan, as you were saying. Some people learn by visually, some people learn by reading. Kind of enabling that is powerful, but that also helps with DEI. But making sure that the platform is WCAG compliant so that people can actually create content, with that.
Key issue. Thank you. Thank you, Shaunak. Susan, do you want to take a run at this one, which is so important?
Yes, because being ADA compliant is also important in the online environment. So when I create my PowerPoints, I don't make them lengthy, because I kept hearing at first when I went into that environment to teach that students didn't like PowerPoints. So yeah, that's what I heard. And I tried to figure out how to make it better. And I know that some students use readers. So my text, my speech text is also in the notes section, and it's brief. And like I said it earlier on, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. I very much follow that on my PowerPoints for the whole class as a whole. I try to make it so that it's accessible. And this past semester, I had a student that needed accommodations, and so we made arrangements for the class to be recorded, and then that recording to be put into the online environment so that she could listen to it and slow it down, stop it, slow it down, stop it, also to meet her needs. And I think that's another adaptation.
That's a great word. I'm afraid for us to end on. We have somehow buzzed through 55 minutes of rapid conversation with great questions from you all, great responses from the audience. Susan, Andrew, Shaunak, what a wealth of information. This is terrific. Shaunak, I want to hand the mic back over to you to tie us together with some concluding notes, but I want to thank everybody. This has been fantastic.
Yes, so for me, thank you for all of you for joining. I think it was a great conversation. Hopefully it was helpful. I just wanted to point out a few resources that might be useful for you. So if you're interested about Yellowdig, how the platform works, we have a demo webinar, which is scheduled for tomorrow. If you look at the screen, there is a barcode. If you take out your mobile and, put your kind of camera app, you should be able to, scan it and you'll get a link. Sign up for that if you're interested to learn more. If this doesn't work, you can go to our website. We also have it in the event section. So that's number one. The second thing I wanted to point out is we do publish ebooks once or twice a year, essentially talking to our instructors and sharing their stories. Essentially, various ways our instructors are using blended learning to drive, using community, building social connections. So again, there is a scannable part here. If not, it's also in our website, if that's useful. And finally, I just wanted to put a plug. We do limited number of free pilots every quarter. So we are now signing up for our next run of pilots. So if you're interested to apply for it, you can also scan it up, which is on the left side. There's a scan, or you can go to our website or reach out to our team. They would be happy to share more information. So with that, I don't know, Bryan, Susan, Andrew, any final words?
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
I love these ideas of co-creation, design, and connection. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. So we are going to conclude now.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.